This is another iRaw podcast.
I shouldn't even say property subjects, because when you're property, the law doesn't recognize you as a legal subject. You have to be a person to be seen as a legal subject.
The idea of personhood has come up several times in Season 1, and I'm thrilled to say that Maneesha Deckha, who is a professor and Lansdowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria, will be joining me in this episode to discuss the idea of personhood. She'll also be talking about the idea of legal beings, which she introduces in her forthcoming book, Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders. Maneesha has a wide variety of research interests, including critical animal studies, animal law and legalities, post-colonial feminist theory, and reproductive law. Maneesha has also been a Fulbright visiting chair in law and society at New York University and is director of the Animal Studies Research Initiative at the University of Victoria. So thank you again for making yourself available. And perhaps I can hand over to you. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in animal studies scholarship?
Sure. It was through a personal kind of, consciousness awakening as a late teenager, really through my elder brother going off to university and coming back with kind of a new perspective and some literature. And I was always very influenced by him. And so I really took that to heart and read the literature, and I was just astonished that this is what was happening in the kind of food industry, and I never really thought about it. And then so I kind of had an immediate switch to vegetarianism overnight. And then when I went off to university, then I transitioned almost, I guess immediately to veganism, and then started exploring opportunities as an undergraduate at McGill University to actually write papers in this area. At that time, it was the early 1990s, and was learning a lot about deconstruction and just, post-structuralism and contestation of various binaries and Western epistemologies. And so a lot of feminist theory too. And so I was always, wondering how come nobody's talking about the human, as a social construction, if everything else is a social construction.
Yeah.
And so I just tried to write my own papers in courses where professors I thought might be amenable to this type of topic. And I just kept up with that interest through law school. And then when I had a chance really in my final year of law school to do more paper-based assessments, I did a large directed reading project with Professor Craig Scott, who was then there, now at Osgood. And so just always was very important to me. I always saw animal issues in tandem with other types of oppressions and marginalizations. So I had a very kind of, what would be known as an intersectional perspective. And I practiced for a little bit, but I was always interested in academia. And from the get-go, when I started here at the University of Victoria, my first and only position was here starting in 2002. I knew I wanted to do my kind of specialty seminar in this area. So, and then I started writing in the area, and that's how it all took place.
So you've been at it for a while. You've really been thinking through these problems in really complex ways. And I've read some of your papers where you talk about intersectionality, and this is increasingly, it's quite surprising when you think about intersectional analysis and how entrenched I think ideas of intersectionality are in many studies at the moment, many areas of scholarship, that the animal, in quotations, has not really been taken on as much. Even now, it still seems to be trying to fight for a seat at the table with intersectional analyses. Do you find that to still be the case?
Yes, I would agree with that assessment, which is, sobering and demoralizing, but also, I guess, understandable, given that the academia, even critically informed spaces, are still so anthropocentric, despite so many implications not to be. Definitely, what is known as the animal turn in academia, at least in North America and Europe, as it's called in English, is developing. But yes, it is still an uphill battle, I think, to convince a lot of critical theorists that this is a serious research issue that should compel, urgent attention.
Rightfully so. Could you possibly, for those listeners who aren't aware of what intersectionality is, or maybe can't even conceive of how animals or the binary between human and animal would form part of such an analysis, could you maybe give us a brief idea of why you think including animals in this line of thought is so important?
Sure. So if you trace the ways in which the concept of something like race was developed, like how do people talk about this? What was it supposed to mean? You can quickly see, and this is like through Western kind of traditions of knowledge, you can quickly see that race was indelibly tied to the idea of species, right? And you don't have to go back too far in history to see that being like the common sense idea that people of different races actually were people of different species. And so the idea of the animal that we see as an idea of species is very much something that's imbricated in demarcating differences among what we now consider, or at least I would say most people consider, to be humans, right? But historically, the idea of the animal is a marking point about who is human and who is not, that divided human beings according to race. So even today, where we might say, okay, we're in a society where we recognize all biological human beings as humans, we are still living with that legacy, and we can still understand ideas about animals and ideas of animality to inform what most of us perceive, even in critical theoretical circles, as being human-only issues, whether that's with respect to race. So a common example is one that was popularized, like in academic circles, by animal geographers, which show how ideas of civilization continue in terms of what is proper, what's a proper way to behave toward an animal, pivot on race. So it goes the other way as well. Our racism or ideas of ethnocentrism also inform our ideas of how we should be relating to animals. And we can also see this with gender. And a very quick, perhaps easy way for many people to see this is like, think about all the animals that are in what we call animal use industries, whether that's the farming industry, the research industry, the entertainment industry. How do animals get? How do animals keep being there? They obviously are living beings that die. Well, they're reproduced, right? And how are they reproduced? It's not through natural reproduction. It's by exploiting the reproductive capacities of the female animals, right? And then coercing like the male animals also, but really it's the female animals with the reproductive capacities that are the linchpin of all these systems. And so a gendered analysis in the human realm, we easily see the relevance of something like feminism to thinking about critiques of reproductive appropriation for women. But you can make the same critique about animals. And further, and here's the intersectional point, the ways in which we talk about those animals in terms of why it's okay to use their bodies that way really correlate with the ways in which we have talked about women in terms of appropriating their reproductive capacities for instrumentalization, and how we still talk about women. So there are parallels, definitely, but also tightly woven kind of continuities between these oppressions. And that's not to say that there aren't differences. Of course there are, but that's what intersectionality brings, the idea that you can't really understand a gender dynamics of something without thinking of the way the concept of the animal functions to this gendering. And the same thing, let's say, with other social forces like race or class or ability, so on and so
forth. So how you come to understand your race is shaped in and through how you understand your species, or how you come to understand your gender is shaped in and through how you understand species. Or are you speaking, structurally as well, I think, what it means to be a woman, or like reproductive practices as a woman, breastfeeding, do I use formula, do I use cow's milk? There's definitely an entanglement of different reproductive practices at play there.
Yes, or just to understand, definitely structurally speaking, although it can be also a personal characterization of our own situation. But the point is that structurally, when we look at systems that we would identify systems of violence or systems of marginalization or discrimination or oppression, however we characterize it, it is not just one type of social force that's at issue, right? That's kind of the inside of intersectionality. So it's not just race, it's not class, it's not gender. But then what is left out is species. And what I've talked about and what others have talked about as well is that the idea of the animal, what it is to be an animal, the idea of animality, of animalization, has been a critical concept to create gender distinctions, to create race distinctions, to create ability distinctions, and to mark out who is human and who is not.
So, we see this play out quite a bit in colonial literature. When you read, for example, I'm from South Africa, and I'm reading increasingly about some of Canada's colonial history. And you see in the US as well how the idea of who constitutes as human was very much at play in terms of determining colonial territories and who had claim to or ownership over land use. The idea of who is and who is not human has shaped, I think, the civilizations we do live in today, like you mentioned earlier. And I think this takes us nicely into what our focus for today's podcast is, which was on the legal concept of personhood. Now, it's come up in several episodes so far as an idea that seems to want to protect animals, or is within the rights-based framework. Is that a correct way of thinking of it?
From within the rights, what was the last part? From within the rights space?
Yeah, would the idea of personhood be within a human rights or a rights-based framework?
Yes, because right now, in legal orders worldwide, almost all legal orders worldwide, animals are conceived of as property, right? And so the systems influenced by British common law have basically two categorizations for all things, all people, all types of beings, property or persons. So personhood has evolved as a concept that is seen, yes, to be a deontological concept, a rights-based concept, because it gives you, as Ronald Dworkin famously said, a trump card against being treated just as a thing, because you are a rights-bearing entity.
So if we were to dial back then to what you were saying about some people have not always been considered human and they've straddled that line of human and animal, would it be right to then say that not all people have been considered persons historically?
Exactly. Yeah. So personhood has Roman origins, and this idea of like a mask coming to acquire legal relevance as kind of a shell that for legal status into which certain beings or entities then are placed and then can claim this legal status. So yes, in terms of biological human beings, it was a very exclusive concept to a certain cohort, right? Privileged by wealth, privileged by gender, privileged obviously by just, race and geographic location in terms of who would be recognized. Today, of course, personhood formally has been extended to all those we perceive as biologically human. And then the hope in many animal rights communities is for the concept to be further extended to embrace the non-human.
Okay, and has this been successful at all? Have any animals been incorporated into personhood status anyway?
There have been a few judgments in South America, and a few kind of suggestions in India how animals are not property, as to how individual animals, usually what we see as the humanized animals like chimpanzees, being called persons. But has that translated into any wide scale acceptance of that concept, such that now all animals are not in that jurisdiction are not seen as property and they're seen as persons? No.
Okay.
It has been very particularized to a certain situation. And even where you have like a judgment, like coming from the Indian context, saying, animals are not things, or animals have rights. It has been, in my opinion, and others have articulated this as well, just like a symbolic kind of rhetorical flourish in a case where the judge is obviously sympathetic to the plight of animals, but again is not overturning centuries of precedent where they're seen as property, and is not disturbing any actual material economic relationships that depend on animals being seen as property. So it usually comes out of the context of what is the most common vehicle in British ex-colonies and that are influenced by British common law, anti-cruelty statutes that try to recognize this concept called welfare for animals, where these concepts might be articulated by judges, but it doesn't disturb what is known as the welfarist regime, wherein animals are property and only really their welfare is attended to when it's not inconvenient to dominant human interests. So there's overwhelmingly all across the world property subjects. And that's actually, I shouldn't even say property subjects, because when you're property, the law doesn't recognize you as a legal subject. You have to be a person to be seen as a legal subject.
So when we use the word person, I think, some people might have an ickiness, or maybe people outside of the legal realm might feel as though, but people are persons. A chimpanzee, as close as they are to humans, is not a person because they're not people. People have created, I think, a correlation or conflation of person and human, which I think animal rights study scholars are trying to disrupt. Is that so?
Yes, I would say there is still a very strong correlation, but it's important to recognize, right, that personhood legally is not a concept that's just reserved for humans. It's been over 2 centuries now that personhood has been attributed to corporations, right? More than that. And that was a fight that, scholars have shown that wasn't even a fight, right? It was just, kind of acquiesced to in a judgment, and then became the norm. So corporations are legal persons, and let's think about, what is a corporation? Is it something you can feel? No. Is it something you can touch? No. Is there some living being breathing there in the corporation? No. It's a completely abstract conceptualization. And that abstract conceptualization is a person.
So how do you then signify what personhood is? If all biological humans are included in the category of personhood, but now you've also got corporations that are considered legal persons, what is used to signify or create the boundaries of when something is a person versus property?
Yes, Claudia, that's an excellent question. There's not a stable, unified answer to that. So there's a scholar, Nader Nafeen, who has done kind of a canvassing in various common law jurisdictions across the world as to how do judges talk about this concept of personhood. And she's basically identified a typology of 3 different types of meanings that are attributed. And one meaning is where personhood is correlated to the idea of an empty shell, where it is a pure legal construct, and so that a person is it could be anything that a judge says it is, or that legislators agree to legislate into law. A second correlation in the judgments that she's canvassed is that personhood is correlated with a religious idea of the human as divine, as sacred. And a third conceptualization is that personhood is limited to a certain type of human being,
a paradigmatic type of actor. And who is that? It's the human being who is the ideal rational actor. So an adult of sound mind, right, of not having any type of cognitive or mental impairment, who is basically an economic maximizer. And so the point being that there isn't like, it's just not like we can look up and say, here's the definition of personhood in most jurisdictions. It's evolved through the common law method and as to, having different meanings in different situations. And even in civilian context, so colonies influenced by, colonized by the French and then influenced by the civil law, which is much more codified, there's not a clear stable meaning of what personhood is. And so this is the, go ahead.
No, carry on.
Right. So this is kind of the, some would say definitely inconsistency, but also other hypocrisy, or then others more optimistically, opportunity to take the existing jurisprudence and apply it toward animals. Because the existing jurisprudence, and this is the rub with corporations. Corporations are, been responsible for egregious harms against animals in terms of the industries that they promote and they embody. Yet they're also the best example of where personhood has been extended to non-humans. Mm-hmm. And so legal advocates make much of this fact that if a corporation can be a person, well, there's the precedent that is so important in legal systems, unless legislators, right, unless our politicians get together and pass a bill into law with the majority support that's needed according to the procedures, you have to go to the court system to get the judgment you want, right? And so without the political will to change the system for animals, you have litigation campaigns going to courts to try to advocate for individual animals in individual situations. And a very popular argument, for example, is that personhood is available to corporations. It should also be available to animals.
So if personhood is available to so I understand that from an advocate's perspective, what you're saying is that it's already been extended, so there's no reason to not extend it further, so that animals are given some form of rights under the law, some form of protection that's due to them as beings in and of themselves, as opposed to property of humans. But considering that the idea of personhood seems to be, it has relatively fuzzy edges, and it seems to be fairly malleable in different legal contexts. Do you still think that the concept of personhood is useful for animal rights advocates and animal studies scholars?
Yeah, so this actually is the subject of a forthcoming book of mine from the University of Toronto Press called Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders. So in this book, I make the argument that obviously property is not a defensible concept, legal status for animals. But also I go against the grain that is prevalent in most animal law communities and rights communities about personhood. I say personhood, while it's understandable and given the current options, basically between property and personhood, why advocates would want personhood applied to animals rather than have them continue to remain to be property, I argue that the concept is not animal friendly. And one of the reasons is what you suggested earlier on. There's a very tight correlation, despite the theoretical availability of personhood to non-humans in existing legal precedents, what we call jurisprudence, there is still in the minds of the public and even in the minds of judges a very tight correlation between the human and the person. And so that's just but one of the reasons that I argue that personhood is not an animal-friendly concept, and that if we're going to, take the bold step of trying to get animals out of the property category legally, which would be transformative, right, to entire social order, why go with a concept like personhood that has various problems in being an animal-friendly concept? And I suggest a different concept, which I theorize in the book, is something I call beingness.
Sorry, so you said that concept is legal beings?
Yes, I would call it beingness. And I suggest it's a different type of legal subjectivity than personhood. So basically, the gist of the critique of personhood is that it's still very much molded, imprinted by its exclusive imperial origins. And so as much as it gets expanded, it's expanded out to women, it's expanded out to children, it's expanded out to peoples of all different, mental abilities, that it still retains the imprint of its original mold. And that's why we have with us in our legal systems, at least the colonial legal systems, the idea of a rational, self-maximizing person. And I argue that animal advocates, to have a chance of having a judge, a court, extend personhood to animals, it requires coming to court with basically a human-like subject to show that this animal, and it's invariably a chimpanzee or an elephant, right, or an orca, that it's the humanized animals in certain cultures that become the ideal litigants in these spaces, understandably so. And then the advocates have to go to court to say, look, this animal is just like a human being. So that what personhood does is promote a strategy of sameness, right? And then I don't really see that as anything transformative equality-wise, because all we're doing is saying this group is sufficient, this out-group is so much like this in-group, we should let them in, right? But it's not really respecting the differences of the out-group or their entitlement to be respected as different rather than same to humans, or what we see as the paradigmatic human, this rational person.
And it might take a long time to achieve that. So if, let's say, chimpanzees tomorrow were to achieve legal personhood, and then orcas were, and then elephants were, and these are the animals where these discussions are happening, then I think you're also drawing a variety of inclusions and exclusions as you go. And at what point would you then get to cows and pigs and chickens?
Yes, precisely. And that's the what I mentioned, discussed in the book as well, right? It's so, if we think of like magnitude-wise, what are the animals that are brought into this world by humans and instrumentalized the most in terms of numbers? It's the farmed animals, and it's the farmed animals on land and the animals in the oceans that are used for eventually coming into human consumption for diet. And these are feminized animals, right? They're not the humanized animals in Canada or in the United States that are going to be the ones that are going to be the ideal litigants that can break that personhood human-animal boundary. And as you say, it is my belief that even if chimpanzees and elephants, and I don't want to diminish how they are suffering in their context, right? But that the strategy will, if it's always dependent on showing that these beings are like humans, those animals that people see as so far removed from humans, like even if you think of insects, right? They're never going to get respect through that strategy. They're never going to get protection through the strategy, or it's going to be so long in coming that it just kind of makes the current strategy, although understandable in a very real way, given what a chimpanzee in isolation on a roadside zoo is experiencing, or what an elephant like Lucy and at the Edmonton Valley Zoo in isolation and chronic disease and pain is experiencing. It seems to be just a strategy that will help very limited number of animals comparatively.
So what made you decide to go with the concept of legal beingness as opposed to maybe something like, instead of personhood, animalhood, that where humans are then incorporated into the animal kingdom? What made you decide to go with legal beingness as the way forward? Because from what I'm gathering, you're proposing a third concept: personhood, property, and legal beingness. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, it innovates. The book innovates this new category, right? So beingness is not recognized now in Canadian law, right? So what motivated me to kind of theorize this new and advocate that the law should take up something like this for animals is approaching the area of animal law from a critical, theoretically informed perspective, one that heavily relies on feminist theory, post-colonial theory. Right now, animal law strategies and the whole kind of world of animal law is influenced by what most of, right, like our Canadian discourse is influenced by, would be liberalism. And so I'm trying to suggest a new subjectivity for animals that comes out of the insights of difference respecting theories. So theories where people, like where beings get to count, not because they're similar to those who already count, and we see of more value thus of worthy of legal protection, but because we want to value the differences that they embody. And so whereas we can so to compare the two concepts briefly, if we understand personhood as marked by an attention to, rationality, putting a premium on the ability to reason, as being marked by values of autonomy understood as not facilitated by the relationships that they're in, but something that we possess individually, we made by ourselves. And we can see beingness as a subjectivity that doesn't ask about the rational person like personhood does. So it doesn't imagine this rational, self-maximizing, autonomous person. Beingness, instead, when we hear the word beingness, what should we think about? We should think about a vulnerable being, a vulnerable being made vulnerable by the relationships in which it is placed, in which we are placed, and a being that is embodied and thus vulnerable because of the pain and suffering that that being can entail. So what I do with my concept of beingness is to say that relationality, vulnerability, and embodiment are three core attributes of a legal being. And so when the law is then asked in various disputes or litigation that comes forward, to think about what does this particular legal being need because of its vulnerability or their relationality or their embodiment, then that points us to a whole different set of questions than what thinking about the rational actor in a situation, what do they need, right? And then of course, it opens up what people do inside.
Sorry. So it's no longer about there's that famous quote. So it's no longer about whether the animals can think or reason. That's not really a matter of whether they should or should not be considered legal subjects. It's a matter of, are they embodied? Can they feel what is happening to them? And should this be considered a legal problem?
Yes, and recognizing the vulnerability. Yes. So that exactly. So that those are the features that indicate to us who the law should care about, and also indicate to us the features we need to look at to attend to make sure that a being is protected.
Okay, I'm with you. And would legal beingness extend? Would you envision in the future where legal beingness is a concept that's used? Would this then extend? You wouldn't have humans and corporations sitting in personhood boxes. You would see legal beingness being extended to humans as well.
It could be. So in the book, I say, like, I'm not saying this has to be reserved for animals, and then I take up the issue, the drawing the line issue about, like, what about plants and other types of non-humans, more so in one chapter. But it could be extended to humans, but I don't discuss that at length in the book. But so many feminists and others have made the argument that personhood is not even a friendly concept for most humans because of its originating kind of mold in an exclusive history. And so the extensionist idea doesn't really work very well. And so why not just change this type of concept to something that does? So it could be applied to humans as well, yes. But of course, all of this would be a sea change in what is currently going on, at least in the colonial legal order of Canadian law, right, in terms of how we understand human-animal relations.
This is both, I think, a legal concept that could be useful, but also one for animal studies scholars who are trying to think through, how to think about animal subjectivity. Like epistemologically, thinking of animals as beings instead of property will take scholars in different ways and different avenues of thought.
Right. Yes, I hope so. Yes.
So, do you have a quote that you would like to read? Normally, at this part of the the episode, I offer people an opportunity to read a quote from a book or an excerpt from their own book that kind of sums up what their arguments are and what they'd like to convey.
Oh my goodness. Well, on that, I would just say that when I heard Joaquin Phoenix's Oscar speech accepting for Best Actor, I'm not sure who helped him with that, but I'm pretty sure he must have received some type of help. I felt in the moment that he just encapsulated like the arguments I've been making in the scholarly context for years, and now that was communicated to hopefully more than 1 billion people worldwide. So that was definitely an uplifting moment. So I'd recommend that speech to anyone. Also, but I'll just bring up the quote I started my manuscript off with. Actually, one of the quotes is his, but the first quote is from Karen Joy Fowler. She is a novelist, American novelist, and her several books, and her book, We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, is a novel I would recommend just to anyone. And I feel that it really gets at this idea of how to think of animals in a different way. And even though it does center around what we would say is a humanized animal. But this is the quote that starts off my monograph. And this is Karen Joy Fowler from We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves. It seems to me that every time we humans announce that here is the thing that makes us unique, our featherless bipedality, our tool using, our language, some other species comes along to snatch it away. If modesty were a human trait, we have learned to be more cautious over the years. And I really think that sums up the history of Western thought about animals. Like the dominant trends in Western thought. Of course, even Western traditions aren't homogenous. That there's a belief that has been entrenched now about human exceptionalism, and which really needs to be critically interrogated, if not for people caring about animals, but caring about so many other things, whether it's zoonotic diseases and their effects, whether it's climate change and its effects, or other devastating anthropogenic action. The human exceptionalism that has grown in Western culture and now is embedded in dominant legal systems the world over is really at kind of the root of this problem. Right? And so that's what beingness is there to say. When we think of human exceptionalism, it's just not about disrupting the human. It's about disrupting what the human is purported to be, as like which human is purported to be exceptional. It's a certain idea of the human, which is informed by ideas of gender and race and class and ability. And so that's why I really like this quote, because it reminds us of the human exceptionalism, but then it also reminds us that it comes out of a specific history that I'm trying to point at and get animal folks to look at when we think of what is the strategy to go forward.
That's so important because, sometimes we speak in speaking about animal rights and animal needs, we reify the division between human and animal, but not all humans have had, equally oppressive or enabling relationships with animals. And that made me, when you're talking now about Western thoughts and the Western ideas of human, I think you've written a little bit about what you think Indigenous knowledges could potentially provide in terms of thinking through some of these ideas. Do you want to possibly mention something about that?
Sure, yeah. So it's important to remember that there are legal orders, for example, let's say Indigenous laws in the Canadian context that have a different conceptualization of human-animal relations and aren't as heavily reliant on claims about human exceptionalism, or aren't reliant on such claims at all. That, of course, is not to say that animals aren't seen as resources or instrumentalized for various purposes within those laws. And so I've also written about that and all the kind of nuances of the complexities of those debates. But the general issue is, though, that we have today, right here in like what we think of Canada, legal traditions, legal orders, laws that can be guides to Canadian law, like our dominant Canadian legal system, as to how to have a better relationship with animals, how to recognize the multi-species nature of our communities, and how to think of a concept even of animal personhood, which is a concept in as scholars have shown in various Indigenous legal orders and non-Western orders globally. That idea of personhood in that context is different than obviously the personhood in the Canadian legal, the dominant colonial understanding. But the point there is that we can think of a new subjectivity that is not property, that just doesn't commodify animals and sees them as things. And so what I've written about is, to the extent that there are multiple facets of society, including dominant institutions like our governments, federal government, provincial government, our law schools, our law societies, even non-legal institutions that are interested in the spirit and actuality of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, then rethinking human-animal relations, non-human relations in total, has to be a part of that, and that should come into legal understanding.
I can hear your little one there. She's calling you.
He doesn't understand because he can't obviously hear you, right? He just hears me talking to the computer.
Hi. That was very cute. Yes, so I appreciate there are many different ways of thinking and collapsing and disrupting the idea of human exceptionalism. And from what we've spoken about today, personhood and your idea of personhood is that maybe there are different ways to achieve that more effectively, like legal beingness. Thank you. And at this stage, we've been speaking for almost 50 minutes, if you can believe it. I just wanted to say thank you so much for... Is there anything else before we close? Is there anything else you'd like to add about personhood that you think, scholars who are maybe interested in this would like to learn more about it? Is there anything you'd like to add before we close up?
Yes, I mean, well, just that, to all the animal advocates that are promoting personhood, I completely understand that strategy, given the legal landscape as abysmal as it is for animals. And I don't want to suggest for a moment that they haven't, thought out different strategies and the pros and cons, and aren't aware of the issues we've been talking about, at least part of it, in terms of how are the, animalized animals, the farmed animals, the feminized animals ever going to make it under this type of strategy. At the same time, I hope the work I've done has brought more into the conversation the insights from critical theory about how we need to complicate how we think about animals from these insights, but also how we do legal strategy or how we promote legal strategies. And so that's why I've tried to kind of theorize this new concept of beingness and show in different contexts why I think it would be practically viable in terms of a legal strategy.
Fantastic. And if people want to, you said your book is forthcoming. When are you expecting it to be released?
Yes, it's expected to be released by University of Toronto Press in the fall of 2020.
Yeah. And if people want to learn more about your work and the type of research that you're doing, where can they find out more about you?
They can go to my website at the University of Victoria Faculty of Law. I'll be soon linking another more detailed or fulsome website. I'd also invite them to check out the Animals in Society Research Initiative. It's a new initiative at the University of Victoria that I'm directing, and it shows the activities we've been able to do and has a lot of interesting links, and that is on the University of Victoria's online academic community. But if you just put into your search engine Animal Society Research Initiative, University of Victoria, it should come up.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for all of the work you do. Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, Claudia. And can I also say, I'm not sure if everyone's aware of it. I just only recently became aware, but there's a search engine called ecosia.org, and every time you use it, it takes the revenue to plant a tree.
Oh, how do you spell that?
ecosia.org.
And it's a search engine, so if you search using that, they'll plant a tree?
Yes, so they're not-for-profit, and as I understand, and so they take their advertising revenue to plant trees.
That's amazing.
So
well,
the more
thank you so much for
users they get, the
sharing
more
that.
advertising. Yes.
Great. I will go and search for your book using that now.
Okay, great. All right. Okay, thank you for your work. That's so exciting. All right, lovely to talk to you.
A big thank you to Gordon Clark for doing the bed music, Jeremy John for the logo, and a huge thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, Apple, for sponsoring this podcast. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.